Alright, so we need to build a Saturn V. I think we're looking fantastic now. So what we're gonna do, so we've got that too. Not bad. There we go. Scroll around to this beautiful, beautiful rocket. This is absolutely going to work perfectly. And we have liftoff. And, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to go ahead and coast on out to the moon. I think we're going to land on the moon. The mun. Well, we're going to land it right here. Dear Matt Lowne, I have a little problem here. You see, I asked my Kerbal engineers to build a Saturn V and launch it to the moon. Unfortunately, they heard me say launch it from the moon. So I don't know if the Blunderbirds are still around or not, but I was hoping you could help me out here. You see, I'd really like to have this entire thing back, you know, the crawler and the whole Saturn V, and properly launch it to the moon. So if you wouldn't mind just picking this thing up and getting it back to the launch pad at Kerbal Space Center, yeah, that'd be great. Let me know if you're around. That'd be awesome. Thanks.
On a lonely planet slowly spinning its way to damnation, amid the incompetence and unpreparedness of lesser space programs, one team stands resilient against the herds, putting their lives on the line to aid those who are previously unaware of the quick-save option. Yes, it's the incredible adventures of Jebediah and his crack team of Kerbinals. They are the Blunderbirds, saving the Kerbin race one stranded explorer at a time.
Oh ho ho! Welcome back once again to another. The videos I'm in the process of moving house, so I've packed my tripod up. So I'm currently have you balanced on like a Coke can. But Everyday Astronaut has reached out to me saying that he has left a Saturn V. I should have just lowered my chair, shouldn't I? There we go. He's left a Saturn V on the mun that needs me to go and rescue it. So he sent me a save file on Twitter. Let's open this up and see what the situation is. Ooh. That's probably not going to buff out, to be honest. I have tried loading this quick save quite a few times. The Kraken really doesn't like it, so I know exactly where he went wrong, right? He built it out of puny, weak American rocketry. He didn't use the superior Russian mechanisms, which is what I'm going to do. Apollo, more like Snore Apollo. We're gonna use a Soviet rocket. We're gonna use the M1, right? Clearly the better moon rocket out of the two. Let's face it. Obviously, we're gonna have to do some modifications to the M1 because that can only have one person in the lunar lander. Obviously, we need one with 3 seats, but shouldn't be hard to just take some creative liberties. And here we are on the launch pad, ready to go. This is the M1 here. I did record the construction of it because it's quite an interesting shape, especially when you're trying to build it in stock KSP. You have to kind of take a few creative pathways to kind of create this shape using the fairings. Unfortunately, my capture software captured the wrong monitor, which was a shame. So we're gonna have to kind of go straight to the launch. I'm pretty sure I got the general shape of it looking pretty good though, and now I've got the new color schemes after. Did they come up with the Making History DLC, the fairing colors, or did they update them a little bit later on? Either way, we can recolor these fairings to make the color scheme of this rocket match up nicely with the actual N1 as we power gracefully through the lower atmosphere with Block A, the first stage of this rocket, which had a whopping 30 engines. I love this rocket. It's pretty much the most Kerbal rocket ever built. I have talked about it actually before in another video called The Failed Soviet Moon Mission, if you're interested in me talking about this rocket in a lot more detail. However, we didn't have all the parts that we have back now, like we have now. Now we've got the DLC, we've got the really big diameter fuel tanks, we can more faithfully recreate the shape of this rocket, as well as obviously we have the Russian capsule pieces, so we can create the upper stages, make them a little bit more true to life, so to speak. But so that video, the rocket didn't really look as good as this one necessarily, but I did spend a lot more time talking about the actual specifics of the mission and rocket design itself, if you're interested for that. But for this mission, not so much. A, because the rocket, whilst it looks a lot more on point, I had to do some modifications on the upper stages to make sure that we could actually carry back 4 Kerbals rather than the 2 astronauts, or cosmonauts I should say, that this rocket was originally designed to carry. But we'll talk about that as and when we get there. We're just about to finish off burning the second stage, or block B, which had 8 engines, so much smaller than the first stage, which actually remains the most powerful rocket stage ever flown, albeit only flown briefly. Every N1 that flew exploded catastrophically. But as with my previous N1 tribute video, I'm trying to kind of keep this true to the mission profile. So these 3 stages are all being used and depleted as they would have been intended. So I didn't actually fly this thing as efficiently as I probably could have done, because I wanted to make sure that the fuel tanks in each stage depleted at the points where I wanted them to. So these first 3 stages are getting our apoapsis to the point we want, and pretty much almost in orbit, and then we're going to fire up block G, which will get us away from Kerbin and get us on an encounter with the Mun. So in case any of you were kind of a bit concerned that I wasn't flying this thing as well as I could, that's why. And my engine choices are a bit dubious as well, again, to try and keep the aesthetics of this thing and the engine count accurate at the expense of making this efficient, if that makes sense. Because, Earth is much harder to get off than Kerbin, so building an N1 and flying it as efficiently as possible in this game, you're going to end up with so much surplus fuel. So, as you can see, the fairings are all deployed. We've got rid of the launch escape system now, which actually was probably the most successful part of the N1. Admittedly, there weren't many successful aspects to the N1, but during test flights and stuff, there were a few disasters, and the launch escape system performed perfectly. So, every cloud, as they say. And here we are, circularizing around Kerbin now, ready to begin our journey to the Mun. And there it is there. I didn't bother with doing a free return trajectory or anything, just because I wanted to perform our circularization burn on the light side of the moon, just for the sake of video aesthetics. YouTube just generally makes videos much darker anyway, so trying to get nice lighting in the videos, I decided, was more important than historical accuracy necessarily, because at the end of the day, lots of changes have been made to this craft. Even though the general aesthetics are exactly the same as the N1, we've had to do a few changes and alterations that you'll see as we get towards Mun space. But let us not get too ahead of ourselves just yet. I'm trying to change my ways. I generally will just spoil the videos as I go along before I even get to certain parts of them, so we're going to try and not do that this time. So, as you can see, the more astute viewers among you may have noticed that we're actually on a collision course with the Mun. That means that when we activate this stage here, the stage before us, block G, will crash, not harmlessly, but crash and, not get left in space on the surface of the Mun. This isn't my save file. This is my dear friend Everyday Astronaut's save file, so I don't want to clutter up his save file too much. So let's just not leave any debris if we can help it. So that stage is going to go. It's going to get destroyed. Goodbye. Rest in peace, block G. And then we're going to go ahead and enter Lunar space. The engine stage we're using at the moment is going to perform our Mun circularization, and then it's going to perform the initial deceleration for the Mun lander, and then we're going to just ditch it, and the Mun lander is going to perform the rest of the slowdown. But again, I just said I'm not going to try and talk too much about things that haven't happened yet. Guess that lasted well. It lasted a very long time, almost as long as the N1 flights did. Ah, see, I made it. I brought things back and made it topical again. It's all good. And with that, we have achieved a circular orbit around the Mun. Hang on, let's not... There we are, we've now achieved a circular orbit around the Mun. And you can see that we're not quite equatorial, and that's because Everyday Astronaut's Kerbals are stranded by the Mun Arch just above a crater, this crater that you'll see on the map screen at some point, I assume. And so the location of that Mun Arch is not quite along the equator, so I actually went for a slightly inclined orbit to ensure that our orbit at some point will be passing over the crater. let's do a couple of kind of normal and anti-normal adjustments just to guarantee that we'd be landing in the right spot, but it's generally okay. So obviously the Mun represents a far easier challenge than the actual Moon in terms of, you know, how much fuel and engine thrust and all that you need to land. So our lander is very, very over-engineered, but for the sake of historical accuracy, we're going to do the first part of the slowdown burn using the stage that we used to, you know, get to the Mun. But now that we've done most of the slowing down, or at least the adjustments that we need to do in order to get ourselves on an encounter with the crashed ship, we can switch over to the lander itself and begin our slowdown. We have to start burning fairly soon because I'm using the Spark engine, which is very, very efficient, which is why I'm using it, but it also has like a terrible thrust to weight ratio. The thrust to weight ratio is actually quite good, but the actual thrust it provides is quite puny, so when we're lifting a big heavy lander like this, it's not ideal. So as you can see on this lander, we haven't got any crew on board at the moment, so we're using a probe core to land this, and that's because I wanted to use the Russian style command pod because the actual lander has this kind of rounded top appearance as well, but the largest Russian style command pod in this game only has 3 seats, so I've had to use a probe core to land this lander next to the stranded Kerbals. I feel like what I just said was not very well worded, but you know, we're going to keep going. So I almost managed to get it perfect, so we used all of the tanks in the first stage depleted when we touched down, but I think I started using some of the fuel from the second stage as well, because unlike the Apollo lander, there's only one engine on the Soviet lander, so we have one engine that is fueled by the first stage, and when we take off, we ditched the landing legs and all that in a similar fashion to the Apollo lander, but then we carry on using the same engine that we used to perform our initial descent onto the Lunar surface. I wasn't sure if I should say Lunar or Muna, the grey celestial body around our home planet's surface. I can just sort of fast forward through our Kerbals getting away from the pathetic American cockpit and get ourselves on the superior. And I think we could all agree the N1 is far cooler than the Saturn V, just because of how ridiculous it is. As Valentina prepares to board the LK lander ready for takeoff, I did use like separate fuel tanks for the upper stage, which I don't think actually is very accurate, but ignoring that, it's fine. And again, you won't see it just yet, but you can see I'm using the junior size docking port in KSP, which originally was designed so that the idea, at least it was to my knowledge, the idea was that Kerbals wouldn't be able to transfer between parts if they were only connected by a junior docking port. In reality, Kerbals can transfer through pretty much anything. They can transfer through batteries, fuel tanks, junior docking ports, the like, but I think the plan at one point was that they couldn't transfer through junior sized docking ports, and so I used the junior docking ports just kind of as a symbolic representation of this idea, because the actual real life N1 lander had a very small docking port as well. The cosmonauts wouldn't be able to transfer through, so they would have to actually go on an EVA to get back from the lander into the command module, and vice versa. The original setup was that there'd be 2 cosmonauts on the ship. One would stay aboard the command module in orbit, one would go down to the surface, perform their EVA activities, plant their flag, collect their surface samples, check their mystery goo, all of that shenanigans, and then, you know, they'd go back and redock with the spacecraft, and then they'd have to perform another spacewalk to get back onto the command ship. So, you know, not as graceful as the Apollo way, but certainly more Kerbal, and then actually that's it. So nothing too much to talk about our encounter just here, just a standard setting up an encounter to get back to the mothership in Kerbal Space Program. I feel like if you want a tutorial, there are plenty out there on YouTube. I don't want this video to just become a docking tutorial, so I'm going to go through this footage fairly swiftly, just so we can get back to the actual, you know, reuniting of our space frogs, I suppose. But I will show you my little Matt Lowne lazy technique of docking. I assume it's like a fairly standard thing, but I've noticed like my username gets mentioned on the subreddit a lot these days. I guess because I made my username so public in this very series, the blunders that you're watching. But I often, when it's not like people just tagging me when people have got stranded, it's people tagging me saying, oh, Matt Lowne's docking technique is the best. So apparently I might have accidentally coined a method of docking, although it's not a very original method of docking. I feel like it was designed this way in the game. But what you do, use your spacecraft that you want to dock, control from the docking port, and double click the docking port you want to dock it to, and then use auto SAS to target the target. Then go to the other ship, do exactly the same thing and then just coast towards it, and even though you're not controlling directly the other ship, it will carry on pointing towards the target, provided there's a pilot, Kerbal, or a probe core controlling it, and then it's just like dead easy. The ships just maintain perfect alignment and point themselves towards each other as they get closer and closer, and then it's just super easy to dock. You don't need one repellent or anything. It's great, just in case you wanted to know that's it now. It's the Lowne method of docking. I'm coining it. That's it. If you would like to use this in your videos, please send royalties to my Patreon, which is in the description. And there we go. So now we've reunited Jebediah, Bill, Bob, and of course Valentina, the Russian Kerbal of the game. She's named after Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first woman in space. I was about to say the first Russian or cosmonaut in space, but in fact she was the first woman in space. So Valentina, obviously being the main female Kerbal, is a homage to her. But as I'm sure it was probably fairly self-evident, we had a probe core on the lander, so again, want to make sure that Everyday Astronaut's save file is not littered with debris around the mun. We can just use the probe core and the 300-ish meters per second of fuel remaining to deorbit the lander, make sure it doesn't get left in orbit, and also in the same sort of fashion as the N1, where all evidence of the program was swiftly destroyed following the end of the space race. There were actually 2 fully flight-ready N1s that were completely scrapped and destroyed in an attempt to cover up the program. When it all ended, it was basically declared that the whole thing was just some paper project in order to make the US believe there was a space race going on, which is kind of sad in a way. It would have been so cool to see like a similar sort of, how the Saturn V's on display at the Kennedy Space Center on those big blue stilts, and you can go and see the massive scale of it. The M1 was pretty comparable in terms of size compared to the Saturn V. It would have been super cool to see the two. They could have even been side by side, couldn't they? NASA could have probably arranged something with the USSR, well, not the USSR now, with Russia now, or, have something to show the two, even if they're not together, just have the two on display so you can go and see them. Would have been cool. Same with the Buran. It's kind of weird how, America, who is quite rightfully so, celebratory of their space achievements, whereas the Soviets, on the other hand, were just desperate to destroy everything in an attempt to cover everything up. Just look at the Buran shuttles just rotting away in a hangar. It's pretty sad, but, I guess we still have the archives and photos and all that to celebrate it. So as you can see, I detached the stages fairly late in order to showcase some nice fireworks upon re-entry. And speaking of re-entry, because we're getting 4 Kerbals back to the surface rather than, 2 cosmonauts, we couldn't really do an accurate recreation of the N1 lander. Although it's a similar thing in that there were kind of 3 parts to the spacecraft. There was the engine stage and the utility bay that was detached, and then the front part, which was like the command unit, was also detached, leaving like the middle bit. I don't know what the actual term is. That was the re-entry module. So this is still like the middle bit, but obviously it's a lot more. I thought we'd land it on land just because that means that Jebediah can plant a Blunderbird's flag, because we couldn't plant one on the mun, because again we had to send a probe down to pick up the stranded Kerbals. So Jebediah can get out. We can make the most of the new 1.6 feature of being able to remove Kerbal helmets. I was about to remove Kerbal heads, but that would be rather morbid. On screen is a link to Everyday Astronaut's companion video to this, as well as a link to a video chosen for you by YouTube's algorithm based on my archive of videos, as well as links to subscribe to me. Also, don't forget to check out Everyday Astronaut's channel if you like videos that are of a good standard, as opposed to mine. And that's the end of the video. Goodbye.